Welcome, everyone. We'll just give a few minutes for folks to come in. Hello, everyone. Just another minute. Folks are still coming in. Once it slows down, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, I think numbers are tapering off, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the third and final in our series for software delivery at scale. In our first webinar, Rob Zuber, our CTO, spoke to the critical role that well-invested software delivery has across the industries. In our second webinar, I introduced the idea that evaluating a full replacement of your existing CI/CD tooling does not need to stop the business, and how to focus on clear measures of impact to make sure you're moving forward with the progress you desire. I'm Eddie Webanero, Global Head of Solutions Engineering here at CircleCI, and what I wanted to share in our third and final webinar was a bit of an operating guide for day 2 and beyond. And when I say operating guide, what I really want to cover are some of the patterns and the anti-patterns that we've seen for large-scale CI/CD deployments, with examples from my own experience, as well as those from some of our customer stories. An important context for today's conversation, coming out of our POC in webinar 2, is how we maintain this idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. My first exposure to these concepts was back in 2009 when I read Daniel Pink's book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. In his book, he clearly demonstrates through a number of studies and sightings that the best way to unlock the output from your professional workers is this mix of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Consider your engineers and employees as tradespersons. If you want quality output from passionate people, you need to focus on the skill as a craft. And I actually attended a ton of management training at a large insurance company, really focused on how do we unlock this from a people management perspective, right? Were we asking the right tasks against the right goals? Were we setting the right level of delegation and autonomy? What I noticed as an IT professional in those conversations, we didn't often talk about the tool chain that our professionals were using. Now, I contrast this to carpentry, chefs, other professional trades, where those skilled workers get to choose and maintain their own tool set, whichever tools they feel are going to most effectively get the job done. And those who watched webinar number 2 recall how important that idea was during our POC, to make sure that we were empowering our teams to evaluate what was most important to them and ultimately select the tool that best fit their purpose. Now, wait a minute. We're rolling out a company standard at this point. We've decided it's going org-wide. And that means a lot of people that we're going to roll this out to are not part of that initial selection committee. They're going to be told to use a new tool. It's one they didn't choose, and it's one they may not like. It's one they may not understand. And this is the major challenge we have in day 2 and beyond. Because in most IT environments, so much of the tooling outside maybe of the individual IDE, where they actually write the code, is already decided for IT professionals. So are we actually enabling the right mix of autonomy, mastery, and purpose for these tradespersons? How do we effectively scale that idea and excitement we had in our proof of concept into an enterprise-wide standard across multiple organizations against competing initiatives? So here's another way to look at this challenge. Well, remember back in our POC that we had this nimble little virtual team, right? And we had all the roles needed to be successful. They were able to make decisions quickly and implement change effectively. But now we're rolling this out as an enterprise-wide platform across the organization. So this POC team is now actually our centralized platform team. And they're no longer our sole consumers. because now this platform team is actually providing service to something like a market team or a business unit operations team. This means that those end users, they're going to need to request some functionality from our platform team. But it goes further, because in most organizations, it's not actually those business unit operation teams that are end users. It's an application team one step beyond. They're the primary consumers, the true end users of software delivery platforms. So now your platform's own success in becoming the centralized standard solution also means that you're no longer your own user, and your actual users are multiple layers removed from you. But innovation never stopped, right? And now it just needs more handoffs to be successful. And that means handoffs or delays. And in fact, we are delaying innovation for our organization, right? The innovation that, by the way, supported the whole business case for us investing in our software delivery practice. So we need to think hard here. What if across each of these layers, teams could adopt and manage the process without bottlenecks and without total chaos? What if they not only were able, but saw it as their own selfish priority to do so? That's exactly the conversation we want to have today. Looking more specifically at the agenda, it's all about patterns of and anti-patterns of implementation, where we see those succeed or struggle. And what we're going to see through today's conversation is they all tie back to how effectively we have unlocked the craft of our tradespeople. How well have we tied these initiatives, enabling the autonomy, mastery, and purpose that our professionals need? So we're going to run through a little more detail on exactly what autonomy, mastery, and purpose mean, as well as the specific patterns and anti-patterns with those examples. So we're starting with why this idea of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I've simplified it for AMP on the slides, why it's so important. Well, let's go back to the problem, right? We have a bunch of users who are far removed, distrusting of our motivation, and uninformed about our product. Easy, right? This is a real challenge, and it's a substantial challenge, right? And so the most successful rollout and the long-term success for our platform is going to include a few common aspects we need to achieve. What we're rolling out needs to be desired, and it's going to be desired because it's seen as useful. We need to make sure it stays useful, and it's going to stay useful when it can evolve. And this thing is only able to evolve when we're enabling innovation in the platform itself. And this last one, to me, is particularly exciting. Actions and messaging are so important for how we roll out adoption. We want to make sure there's a clear purpose, right? But allowing the teams to flex their individual skills and knowledge to actually raise their own craft and bring the organization along to a new level, that's what really unlocks the potential of your people and your process, right? Versus the other risk here is that people feel like this is a change being kind of forced on them, right? Or pushed from corporate or the top down, people who are uninformed and don't know, right? It creates a negative sentiment before folks even give the tooling a fair chance. So let's dive through each one of these in more detail. I'm going to start on the back end actually with purpose, because I think it's a no-brainer, right? Teams want to know why what they're working on is important. But reasons alone are not sufficient. We can't just share a bolded list and say this is important because of A, B, and C. What we need to enable is the actual reasoning, right? We need to help people find meaning in these goals. It has to be important to every individual. They should be able to answer the question, why is this change meaningful to me? And the general answer that we want to be able to provide for these employees is that this change is acknowledging your craft. It's going to draw a line below the things of your value and eliminate the toil and burden of your work, right? And it's going to provide more time for you to master the craft that we so desire from you, right? And that's the messaging we need to make sure resonates with our employees. And that point of mastery there, I think, is really pinnacle in this idea of craft. And it's worth a little more discussion, even though purpose might feel obvious. In mastery, we all want to be good at something. In fact, I'd argue we all want to be great at something, and we want to be recognized as being great at something. The more we feel we are good at something, the more we lean in, the more we learn, the more we practice, the more we grow. And that growth is how we become great. So when we think about our software delivery process, how do we let teams get great at pipelines? How do we actually let them practice software delivery, right? Because that's how you get great at something. Practice, 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 iterations. Nobody starts as a master. I have a silly example of that. I have two young children, And a couple of years ago, my daughter started playing soccer at the age of 4. Now, play soccer is a bit of a stretch because these kids would meet on the field once a week. They would do drills for 15 minutes, and then they would play a 30-minute game, right? Now, the game, you can imagine, with a collection of maybe a dozen or so 4-year-olds, was a bunch of kids running, some of them spinning, some of them sitting, there was twirling, there was laughing. What was not occurring was a game of soccer, right? Did I care? No. I was ecstatic. I was delighted because that was my intention for being there. My daughter was outside on a lovely day, playing with friends and getting exercise, and that was my only expectation, right? But if my expectation was to come and see a professional team and production level performance, I would have been really upset, right? I might have canceled the entire soccer program because it was such a catastrophic failure. And this is exactly what happens in software delivery. When teams can't practice, bad things happen. And we set an unfair expectation for what they can achieve without that practice. The last point I'll talk about is autonomy. I'd like to think this is taken mostly for granted these days in a number of ways and places. Even the highly regulated, safe model for enterprise agile adoption hands a significant amount of planning input and control to individual application teams. And in our delivery of any IT platform, especially those kind of so critical to the business output, the question of enabling autonomy is a tricky one. The way we do it is largely self-service, right? Because if you don't enable self-service and you have this manual submit and review process, sometimes to a paid professional, it can feel like, hey, listen, I know that you're a highly compensated professional, but here are some plastic safety scissors, because metal scissors, they require director approval, right? That's not how we want to treat our employees. Autonomy, the idea of autonomy here is allowing your tradesperson to say, I know that scissors can be dangerous. I know they're sharp, but they are in fact the tool that I need and the tool I'm going to use to be successful, right? And allow them to pull that off the hook. So in the last one, I said mastery was so important to our craftspeople, right? I would say that autonomy, on the other hand, is terrifying to our governance teams. The idea of autonomy can be terrifying to the organization proper, right? How do we give folks dangerous tools and still feel safe as an organization? And that's exactly what our patterns will hopefully cover. All right, so let's jump into those patterns. Format here, for each one of the patterns, I just want to introduce kind of the concept, a pattern, an anti-pattern or two, and then share some examples. Starting with the first pattern here, this is kind of the base pattern. This is all about alignment and autonomy, right? Basically, when you're starting this initiative and you're rolling out a platform that you know is going to be pervasive across the industry, all of a sudden that clear and open horizon you once had is now filled with additional teams. It's the security team, the compliance team, external auditors, and even your customers. And they all have questions about how your enterprise platform is going to work, how it's going to be secured, how it's going to operate, etc. And so there's two anti-patterns I kind of see in this approach. One pattern, an anti-pattern, is the appease all method, right? Well, because these other stakeholders are so legitimately important, and I do believe that, we're going to make sure that we collect all of the requirements upfront from every single one of them, right? And we're going to make sure that we're clear on what they want and any additional vendors that they might want to add to the mix, right? We're probably going to need some sort of decision committee to make sure that that's done fairly. We're going to add a few commas to our budget. We are definitely increasing the level of effort involved here, and we'll get to adoption at some point as well, right? Another anti-pattern that I've seen, it's kind of maybe I think the polar opposite of that is this replace mentality, right? I see this often in organizations where new leaders have come in to kind of take over a struggling organization. And the mentality can be, well, they had their chance to modernize, so now I'm going to give it to this other team, right? And they tend to come in with new vendors and new process to replace peer teams. And so we're going to grow a new team, and they're basically going to push the other groups out, replace their functionality with modern functionality. We're comfortable doing that because we've already assessed and speculated a 5-year ROI and why this is going to be great and how we're going to reorganize the company as well as our investments to meet this goal, right? Both of these are anti-patterns, and we'll dive deeper into some examples later on. Instead, where we see customers be successful and where I've been successful in my own career is this idea of approaching it with a curiosity and a confidence, right? we don't need to have ownership over these areas to influence them. We start with understanding. There's this analogy of Chesterton's fence. I think it's a made up story, but the idea is two men are walking in the field. They find a fence. Why is it here? Who knows? We should take it out. The second man says, no, we shouldn't because we don't know why it's here. And so the whole point is you need to seek understanding of why those fences were there in the first place, because there is a valid intention. It may no longer be valid in today's environment. It might be dated, antiquated, etc., but it was valid at one time. And until you understand that, you shouldn't tear down any fencing. Right? So you need to understand the existing decisions first. And once you understand those, then you can start to articulate mutual benefit of automating those fences, right? If you put, a sensor in front of that gate and it can automatically detect a person walking and open it for them and not let cows through, that's great, isn't it? And so you can start to drive those kind of things only once you've built the understanding and curiosity. That takes a lot of questions. It also means you need to start where it hurts, not where it only hurts you and your team individually, but really where you see it hurting at those boundaries between teams, where that friction's introduced. All right, so let's walk through an anti-pattern example here. Rob Zuber, our CTO, shared back in webinar number 1, how important this idea of supply chain management is. So much of the code that your team maintains today isn't their code. It's code from external components, external teams, external organizations. So understanding where these assets are coming from, inspecting and managing them is critical. And so as the owner of a software delivery platform, we knew that this was a critical challenge. And so we started to work off with multiple groups. And I actually engaged an external vendor to pull in peers from security ops, compliance, basically making sure that we had the legal requirements and the security requirements covered. We spent months pulling in more and more stakeholders from those teams, building a list of more and more requirements until we finally got agreement up to the C-suite level for a major initiative to overhaul our supply chain risk, right? We basically put an ROI in front of the executive team that by implementing this strategy over 3 years, we'd be able to reduce this risk of our software delivery process. We signed a multi-year contract with the vendor. We outlined and approved our implementation plan, and then it sat on a shelf for multiple years. Not even on our shelf, but the vendor shelf. I don't even think anybody downloaded it, right? The intention that was behind the initial push for this, going through that long process of creating alignment, what came out the other side wasn't something that we could reasonably move or act on, right? It was too complicated. It was too morose. And so ultimately that project was shelved and abandoned. Right. The budget was approved. The contract was signed. Implementation plan was approved. Everything looked good from the planning perspective. Zero implementation ever occurred from that. All right, so let's look at another example of patterns and anti-patterns. And this is kind of moving on the initial or on from the initial alignment. And now we're working on the rollout. There's the anti-pattern I see here, which is a really common anti-pattern, is a big bang approach, right? We're basically going to work for, we've already architected a solution that we know is going to work for the entire company. We've got the flow charts and diagrams to prove it. So we're going to use a service-heavy implementation. We're going to get some outside consultants to kind of get things in place for us, right? They're going to lay the foundation for us to be successful on. And we're going to do it across these 3 phases, kind of based on strategic business need of each team, and ultimately reaching this incredible ROI that the vendor has assured us is going to be there. The challenge with this model, this anti-pattern, is that nobody's actually the leader in that situation. And nobody, internally at least, is actually an expert. Everyone is a little bit skeptical of where this project's going because they haven't seen anyone yet be successful with it. And ultimately chaos and rumors run rampant, right? And so where, in my experience, where this ends up is, somewhere between phase 2 and 3, you shelve the project where, and you're probably months after where the project should have been completed to begin with. Big bang rollouts, they just never work. This is the waterfall methodology of software development that we have long since learned. There are better and more effective ways to iterate through this process. And that's exactly what the pattern is that we see be successful. Instead of letting all your teams loose up front and saying, we're going to these 20 teams and then these 40 teams and then these 60 teams, you need to start smaller. And you got to start with some white glove support. You got to pick a few individual teams who are actually going to help pave the path for you. They're going to leave their handprints in the concrete, so to speak. That's giving them a clear purpose. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? We have some, what are yours? But by the way, you're not just bringing requirements, you're bringing solutions. And they feel that mastery and autonomy, this is solving my needs. I like where this is going. This is solving my challenges. It also means giving them latitude, right? To kind of push on existing boundaries, try new things, experiment, and give them support to do that, right? That kind of fail fast mentality, like things could go wrong and this might go wrong. And I, as the leader of this team, take responsibility for that, not you as the individual executing on this model. Anytime someone achieves success in that model, grandstand it, amplify it, celebrate it, right? Especially in those early days, building up that support is so important to grow your user base. Ultimately, when you approach it in this way, iterative and amplifying, you're going to see that you're going to actually drive an eagerness for consumption. And through that consumption, you can start to then identify the patterns. And only over time, identifying those patterns of consumption, can you then start to automate and onboard more of those. I call out the amplification. It's so important. Celebrating and amplifying your use cases and success stories not only builds a sincere support from potential users, right? It kind of undermines that whole resentment risk we run with a top-down model. But it's also incredibly useful to you organizationally in year 2, 3, 4, and beyond, where you need to seek additional budget because you've succeeded with the adoption of your platform, right? The individual users knowing success as well as your executive team knowing success is ultimately where we need to get in rollout. All right, so I want to walk through an example of what I thought was a successful iterative rollout. And to do that, I need to start with the problem. This is at 2010 or so, early days of DevOps. And in fact, we were hiring our first DevOps automation engineer was the title. We were working hard on CI, and I think we were doing pretty good on the integration side. The continuous deployment side was a challenge. And there were several other teams around us. And there was a few things in those early days. They didn't want us in their space, and they had no interest in playing in ours. And so it really was this classic siloed model of a traditional IT organization. To deliver a new application took somewhere between 6 to 18 months. And that wasn't development initiatives. That was mostly duration due to handoffs and queues between teams. And this diagram shows exactly what some of those teams were, right? But each individual layer had to be worked through, and there's dependencies across these, right? You couldn't go back, to step 6B before step 4A was completed. So the advice and kind of, I worked through this with one of the architects on my team. This is crazy. We got to fix this, right? And raising the advice we got was, absolutely, this is crazy. We're going to get executive alignment on this. We're going to form a joint committee. We're going to do some design sessions. We're going to enterprise architecture involved. The PMO is going to run this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Flashbacks of that 3-year project that was shelved earlier. So unfortunately, even though I was young in my career, the director I was working for knew better and said, that is not going to get us anywhere fast, and we have an immediate problem. And we were seeing a new way of working on the horizon. Let's test that. So instead, we worked with a single admin over one of those fences, over the wall in ops. And we were talking about specifically the friction of deployments, right? We have an application. It works on these machines. It works in our CI environment. We want to get it into the production environment, the dev environment, the staging environment, right? Do you have that automated? Of course. Can we run the automation? No. Can we put a wrapper around the automation that we can run? Maybe, right? And so with that simple conversation, granted it took 3 or 4 meetings, we really opened up a bunch of new possibilities. A couple weeks later, we had fully automated deployments to IBM WebSphere with a combination of Python and Bash scripts. And it wasn't pretty, but the marketing team ended up owning and adopting this, right? And they actually ended up replicating it for other teams. And I remember the first time it happened, because it made me laugh, I got an email from my team that said, hey, Eddie, we just got and this is the ops team. We just got a request from the legal team. They want to, quote, implement the scripts Eddie team is using for deployments, right? And so I had a conversation because we had that kind of one rogue actor in ops who did this for us. And so we had to have a conversation with the managers and the leadership team and say, this is what we're doing. And the pattern's been working, by the way, for the past 9 months. Let's continue to roll it out. So we actually saw the consumers drive directly to this ops team, a very strong signal that there was value in them as their own masters with the autonomy they had to solve this challenge. We didn't have to be the ones telling them to do that, right? We didn't try to replace or assume that we knew better. We tried to bridge understanding, reduce that toil between our teams, and all this other magic value came from it. All right, so let's talk about scaling and growing access and enablement, right? And honestly, I think this is the classic central versus distributed challenge. And it's a great pattern to conclude on because it is so common and so acute across the industry, right? It's alignment at the top, or autonomy is chaos. It's control centralized, or rogue empowerment. How do we balance that? And if you picture a large organization, potentially like yours, multiple lines of business, all supported by a central IT organization, potentially using things like shared services and cloud infrastructure, right? And that team, maybe that's your team, they seem to be taking on all these centralized responsibilities. Well, unfortunately, when you think about a CI system, right, this platform that we're building out, it needs pervasive access to credentials and keys in production systems. And so that means we need a tight level of control, right? And that's inappropriate. And so it is the target of scrutiny. And especially when we're talking about accessing credentials for things like databases or production systems, it's really important that we understand the resistance that these platforms might see, right? So how do we scale access, acknowledging there's a very real risk to scaling access incorrectly for these platforms? So the anti-pattern that I see here, there's actually two, and I put them on a spectrum here because they are opposite sides. It's the three bears, the too hot, too cold, just right. On the left-hand side is one anti-pattern, which is just centralizing control, right? We can't risk it. It's too important. Too many humans have access. We got to pull it in, right? Centralized teams, they end up getting really frustrated because they're not doing much more than working on tickets, right? They don't get to flex their mastery. They don't get to really understand why their purpose is benefiting anyone. It's just ticket, do it, right? Application teams on the other end of those tickets, they're just frustrated. Everything takes 2 weeks. And by the way, these people on the other end have no idea what I'm trying to do, right? And the ops teams are like, by the way, these app teams on the other end have no idea what they're trying to do, right? And it's not pleasant for anyone involved. And so when organizations try that, or even if they haven't, they tend to swing to the other extreme, which is kind of like the Oprah's pipeline model, right? Everybody gets a deployment. And now it's not necessarily everybody, but it's each business unit, each major application portfolio or program gets their own full deployment of a software delivery pipeline, CI/CD tooling specifically. Well, that helps minimize the blast radius, right? You essentially now have kind of moved the people supporting it closer to the need, and you're still not giving it to every single person in the company, and that's good. Each line of business kind of has their own implementation, and I feel that they have some level of autonomy, and that's good. The challenge is that often you need to introduce additional subject matter experts in those units to support that configuration, because now what was centralized is being scaled out, and so you need more people out there to support that, and that becomes expensive. Those individuals still tend to be a collection of humans with keys to really important things that can still make really important mistakes and have really important impacts to the organization. Application teams are still waiting, although it's a little bit shorter of a wait, and you lose all consistent practice and oversight, right? So this really is probably the worst anti-pattern in my opinion. If I had to swing on one side of this pendulum, I would go closer to the control side personally. But to circle back of our challenge of empowerment versus control, we don't want one or the other. How can we give autonomy without risking the business, right? And the answer is, well, this is the golden age of automation, right? And so this is where that analogy of Chesterton's fence comes into play. All the existing controls had a reason, and they're likely still valid. The implementation may not be. So let's partner with our folks to understand where that toil is in between teams and find that common ground and eliminate it. Allow each of those teams to stay in their lane. We're not replacing anyone else or pushing others aside, right? Let them have the same autonomy, mastery, and purpose too, by presenting that compelling argument to them, right? Of why this is useful or beneficial. Don't try to assume what is too far removed from you, right? An example I had of that in my early days is as one of those kind of middle tier teams, basically being told by central ops that, well, we can't give you these credentials because you might give them to the end application team, right? They were trying to solve for what the ultimate end user was doing. They weren't solving for what we, the customers, needed, which is to build out platforms, right? And so that's really important. Think about who your customer is and let them solve for their customer. And then with, I mentioned the point of automation here, policy enforcement. There is so much tooling today to automate policy enforcement. It is ripe, it is primed for it. And so that's a great opportunity to really find that middle balance. And so the example I have here is actually a single example that includes both the patterns and anti-patterns. It's kind of this exciting who's going to win scenario. So I mentioned we started with this kind of homegrown software delivery platform, right? That was a collection of shell scripts early on and had since grown. And so now we were using some good industry standard tooling, a collection of some awesome open source tooling. And it was spreading, right? Word was spreading, adoption was spreading, and more teams in both our business units and even central ops teams were using it. And it was starting to create a strain on our platform team, right? Because we were still doing a lot of that high touch onboarding. We were, I might say, scared, but we were certainly hypersensitive to run afoul of the central governance teams, right? We were kind of an application team pushing our way into ops, and we were taking major risks. And so we were really keen not to run afoul of any of those issues. And we wanted to make sure every team we onboarded was doing things right. That created really great outcomes. It was really slow onboarding. And one of the market teams, so think about these multiple lines of business, all kind of competing functions across the broader company, they saw resistance. They had resistance rather to our selection, and they saw this slowness. There was a slight queue to get into our platform, and they saw that as an opportunity to exploit. And so they rolled out the anti-pattern of Oprah's pipeline model. They scripted a deployment of self-contained team-based Jenkins instances. And so now, instead of having to wait in line for the centralized team, you could basically just go off and be your own admin. And that's awesome. And that got the jump on scale for sure. They definitely scaled enablement and access. There were several dozen deployments of full software delivery CI/CD stacks across the organization now. And we saw demand in our platform kind of take a little dip. It had a real impact on how users were coming to our door. However, we felt strongly that granting too much permission was not the right solution. It would erode the trust in our platform, and ultimately, we were kind of scared that central ops would just take it away from us. So instead, we focused on automation. And our technicians who were doing that manual onboarding focused on looking for patterns of consumption. Were they consistent? Did they differ by market? Did they differ by language? Did they differ by team? Where were those, right? And we started to codify those. Those patterns became templates that were basically JSON text files that anyone could contribute and improve upon. And these patterns allowed teams to now self-provision our services, still doing all the right things that we thought were so important. So fast forward 12 months, this model of kind of competing, and all of a sudden, a major audit violation was handed down. Whose team? It was one of these everyone gets a pipeline teams. An admin team had inadvertently connected, or I guess intentionally, whatever. They had connected their instance to a public code repository. And so not only do we run risk of potentially running external malicious code inside our organization, but we risked potentially exposing proprietary code outside our organization, right? And so with a single one of these instances going outside of what was accepted policy, the risk was determined to be far too great, and that fad of everyone being their own admin ended very quickly. Fortunately, our onboarding by that time was humming along. We had embraced this idea of automation and self-service, giving our customers the autonomy they need. So not only could they provision a template from scratch, but they could declare exactly what services and credentials they needed without any human intervention, and they were off and running. And all of this done in a manner blessed by compliance. So we recovered from our anti-pattern and now had a clean contract between all the different teams. And we were actually gaining support from our centralized op team because we were deflecting work from their backlog, right? So we could provision things at a snap. We could still tailor it to customers. Folks got the credentials they needed and nothing else. And you can see that's the right-hand side of this hockey stick curve, right? You can see in the adoption there, which spiked, but more importantly, there was actually alignment happening behind the scenes. We enabled a critical business milestone. In less than 2 years, these nifty templates, which all happen to be cloud-based templates, flipped our workload ratio from having 80% of our workload on-prem to having 80% of our workload in the cloud, right? So autonomy actually drove the alignment and drove the business went there. All right, not everyone wants this. And this was a hard truth for me. I was legitimately shocked in my early career to find that many more of my developer peers than I expected to were perfectly content with the status quo, right? The sentiment was, why would I take on additional responsibilities and learning I don't have to do today, right? Not all roles and people will successfully change as an organization evolves, and performance management is a very real challenge of our work as leaders. However, let's not discount anybody so quickly, right? Let's focus on AMP, right? Are we exposing a message, right? The importance of what's going on here. Are we giving slack in the system so that they can use a little autonomy and master their game here? We need to retrain the laggers and make sure our messaging resonates across the organization, which again is going to be tailored to each individual. These people are masters in their domains. We need to understand their concerns, show them that you understand their concerns, show them that you understand and respect the mastery that they bring. You know, autonomy, point out the coupling they have with other teams, right? That the autonomy they don't have today. Focus on the purpose, right? That they're not able to kind of master what is so important, their actual objectives that they're striving for. And really paint for them the picture of how this service-based model is going to enable the autonomy they need, the mastery they need, and not focus on, you know, there is some training and ramp-up work involved. All right, we're closing in. Final slides here. My final tip is really just how to avoid your ancestors' fate. That is how not to be the platform getting replaced in 2 years, right? In webinar number 2, I mentioned this idea of a 1+ strategy, and that's really, I think, how we unlock it. Eventually, tooling gets outdated, even the best tooling, right? History shows us it tends to be that way. Some tooling lasts a long time, some tooling does not, but eventually all tooling is going to get stale. So how do we avoid blindly entrenching ourselves to outdated tooling? Well, the answer is simple. We don't attach ourselves to tooling at all. We attach ourselves to the problem. We attach ourselves to the impact. Now, that's easy to say and it's hard to do, but what it means in large enterprises is that you don't have a Jenkins team or even a CI/CD team. You have a software delivery team, and they're responsible for that mission end to end. And you empower them to have a quote unquote 1+1 strategy. That is one strategic solution. This is the enterprise standard. It is well funded, it is highly integrated, and it is fast flowing, right? But we still are going to encourage and support exploration without like rampant proliferation of tools. And the way we do that is by encouraging this team to actually pull in suggestions, advice from the larger community base and help explore tomorrow's offerings, right? So if someone's complaining that what your platform is doing isn't meeting their needs and they've got a specialized use case, don't say, well, you're 5% of our user base and we don't care about you. Say, that's really interesting. Would you like to come and work with us and figure out how we can change that, right? And maybe it's within our platform and maybe it's new platform. And we're going to support the exploration either way, but we're going to do it within this group that's responsible for this problem. They bring their code and ideas to this, they leave with your culture and inspiration, and it's a win-win for the organization, regardless of what you choose for tooling there. All right, so in conclusion, any large-scale platform, no matter how amazing it is on day one, is going to accrue debt, and it's going to accrue criticism over time. We need to make sure that we're approaching that software delivery platform with a mindset of enabling your internal customers. Those customers are professional, right? We are fueling excitement and impact with explicitly tying their value as tradespersons. And that means unlocking autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Because with the right approach, even mission critical platforms like this software delivery platform can actually be deeply revered, loved, and they can get the care and attention that many hands across the organization can provide. And that support and passion creates alignment. And it's going to make it easier for you to succeed as an organization. It's going to make it easier for you to create the alignment you need to spread best practices, patterns, without any top-down mandates. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. We do have some extra time. If anyone has any questions about the content in today's webinar or the previous two, I'm happy to discuss them. And just so folks know, there is a Q&A button down below you can put in. I see a few folks are. So if you have a question, just go ahead and type it in there. We'll try and answer a few online, and we might have to kick some offline. So let's see. I'm going to try and rephrase this one a little bit, but I think The question is going back to the 1+1 strategy I just was speaking to, and the question is essentially, how do you avoid that turning into a 1+100? Well, I think the point here is centralizing ownership of it, right? Is that you let your teams own a problem domain, and not a specific tooling. So anytime there is a +1 and a +1 and a +1, even if you go to 2 or 3 or 4 initially, as long as that's owned by the same team and a shared workload for that team, they're going to pretty quickly self-regulate, right? They're going to realize we're taking on too much responsibility and we got to kind of throttle this back and vet these better. So that's my advice there is do it in an open, encouraging manner, but do it in a centralized place. Ideas can come from anywhere, but you can't spring up initiatives anywhere. Another question here on culture. So I think this the question is about understanding, right? So how do you implement culture change where you might have a lack of understanding for the basic principles, CI/CD, containerization, etc., right? And I think that's a great question. Ultimately, I think where I would try and take this question is back to that understanding is something that needs to exist for a tradesperson. And so ultimately, we want those people to grow that. But we can't start with, hey, I need you to learn all this new stuff. We got to start with why it matters to them. So in that situation, with this particular customer department team struggling to kind of see the value of that, that's exactly where we need to start, is what is the purpose of what we're doing, and tailor it to them. What are some of the activities that this particular team does that is painful for them today? And can you find some other experts in your organization that could help alleviate that pain? Not by telling them how, but by showing them, hey, this is an alternate in a way that we do it that helped us. Do you think that would help you? And so in this conversation, you want to be really careful to kind of delegate that mastery back to them, but really, it sounds like in this case, focusing on the purpose, because once you unlock that purpose, their desire for mastery will have them, pull in that knowledge. Of course, you're going to want to make sure you provide that enablement and the training is necessary, but I think definitely starting with the purpose. A few more questions coming in. Someone asking about a specific role, dev experience. Where did dev experience teams, hold on, gotta clean up my role here. Where did dev experience teams fit into this? So I would say that dev experience, it's actually a role and it's a measure. It's a means. And what I mean by that is that every application or every person from the central platform team out to the application team, they should all be focused on developer experience, right? Is this stable? Is this intuitive? Is it performant? Is it fast, right? And does it do the thing I need it to do? I think is really what dev experience matters, right? It's there when I need it to, it does what I want it to do, and it's intuitive and I can understand it and make good purpose out of it. So that's everyone's responsibility. And that's really where you make sure your model is supporting that model of encouragement. But if you have existing roles today or teams specifically designated as DevX, then in my experience, that probably means that they're most likely that platform team. They're either that platform team or kind of the what I had as like the business operations team, right? So they're not the end users themselves, but they're ones focusing on a pattern. There's tons of great opportunity for them. They are really the ones who identify the patterns of consumption across all the different application teams, and not necessarily come up with best practices themselves, because that won't be fit and tested for the end users, but work with those end users to say, hey, I'm seeing a pattern. Can we get this together and figure out what is the model that's going to work here in the field against these real use cases? Cool. Let's see, one more. Sorry about this. You mentioned terrifying ops teams, but you didn't calm us down. How do we maintain any control model? So I apologize. I want to be clear on a few things. I did try and calm you down a little bit. The idea here is policy management, right? Automation of policy management. And so I just want to make one thing clear. Governance is critical. I'm not advocating that we bypass governance in any way. And so my point with Chester and Suspense is make sure we do understand those controls. In CircleCI specifically, I will say our approach to this is a tool called config policy management. We basically let governance teams define policy centrally. They can do allow and blocks against what any individual application developer can do in their configuration.yaml. And so that's one way that we're trying to calm the nerves of a governance team like yours. But I think generally, regardless of the tooling, if it's not a platform like CircleCI, it's how do you find ways to automate the application of the policies versus manually reviewing and approving what teams are doing. Don't let teams just do anything they want, though. You need to make sure some sort of fence is there. It's just what manner of fence is there. Another question, I apologize, I'm not sure I fully understand it. Where can I find a real project to train myself? So if this is kind of a core, actually, so potentially related, there is, I don't have a specific date for it, but we'll share it out. There's a webinar coming up with one of our solutions engineer from the EMEA region, who's really going to dive into specific questions and challenges that previous CircleCI customers have had in large scale migrations of their software delivery platforms. And so that might be a content that's more useful to you kind of at that practical implementation level. All right. There's a few more questions, but they look pretty specific, so I think we'll defer those offline. I'll save another minute or two in case there's any other questions. Awesome. Really appreciate the time from everyone today, and I hope this content was useful for you all. Thank you so much.